This presentation was a presentation that was also delivered at the Yokohama Sports Conference from the auspicious venue of my dining room in Dewsbury, not quite Yokohama. It was done in about 45 minutes, so I'm going to try and do this in 10 to 15, could be a challenge. So why sport? So sport is supposedly meaningless, but yet carries massive meaning to many people in the world, and has been used as examples to kind of change the world in many different ways. Why is it so powerful? Well, people genuinely love sport. They genuinely love playing their sports. They play their sports with passion. They have commitments. So people will quite gladly dedicate their lives to pursuing a sport that they don't gain any kind of material value from or anything else. People's identities are very much built in around their sports. I can remember going back to my undergrad days back in Loughborough, and the first thing that people ask you, what are you? What do you do? And your answer was your sport. I'm a rugby player, I'm a cricket player, etc. It wasn't, I'm Harvey from Dewsbury or whatever. We build lifelong friendships and relationships out of sport. Hence why we're all here now. We can work in a sports department. And some people also talk about kind of like a destiny. So it's their dream, it's their destiny, it's the thing that they want to become. And people set their stall out from really, really young ages to go out and to achieve something within a sport. So it then leads me to this kind of question that I've had scratching my head now for a number of years. In terms of sports coaching, why is this stuff not really written about? Try and do an academic search for love and passion in sport coaching. It just doesn't exist. And that's really kind of problematic in that all the stuff that sport is charged with being able to do, and hence why sports governing bodies receive large sums of money from the government to be able to enhance people's lifestyles, to enhance what they can achieve in life, to bring people into a society that are being disenfranchised, etc. It supposedly leads to kind of things like leadership, fair play, recognition, and so on. But we're not really getting to the nitty-gritty of how do we get this kind of love and this passion, and how can we have it revolving around what we do in sports coaching. Well, some of the issues I would argue are the current paradigms that are used within sports coaching research, particularly academia. So we have some really good stuff out there. I'm not decrying that in any way, shape or form. But for me, it really fails to get underneath of the whys, the deep, the meaningful stuff behind sport, of why we actually do it. Why are we so passionate about, for me, chasing a little leather ball around a field and chucking it at a piece of wood? And so it makes no kind of obvious common sense, but it must do for me and so many other people to kind of dedicate our lives to it. The cynic in me would also argue that we don't focus on this in coaching because you can't do a drill. You can't create a drill to make people more passionate. You can't sell a coach a load of coloured cones or a phone app. There's no YouTube videos of this is how you get your athletes to suddenly love the game when they haven't done before. So it's not something that we would really necessarily talk about, which again seems strange. If these are the kind of the key motivations and criteria behind why we participate in sport, why isn't this discussed day in, day out? So I argue that existentialism is quite a useful philosophical standpoint for us to be engaging with, to try and actually work towards answering some of these issues, if you like. Existentialism is seen as a way of giving meaning to your life, and it's each individual's responsibility to come up with their meaning about their life. And you see, I talk a lot about authenticity and building life that's true for you, and not something that's dictated to you by society, by a religion or anything else. Existentialism and existential phenomenology gets rid of this idea of complete free will, which is where obviously humanism sits, but also gives us some element of free will within the kind of the constraints of life. So somewhere between cognitive and the behavioralist approaches, so the situated freedom. Existential is also an ethical theory. There's an awful lot about human values, about meanings of life, and again linking to this authentic way of how we live, and living towards our own intrinsic values and not those that are set out by others. Existential writers often talk a lot about being, and we suggest that being leads the knowing and the doing and the having, etc. So we need to really unpick what it is to be a human, to understand human beings, and to then be able to engage with these other human beings, certainly as a coach, and then facilitate their life through the medium of sport. So existentialists call for us to lead an authentic life, i.e. a life that's right for us, that is us living by our values, what we believe to be the right thing to do. Now that's not easy. That's downright difficult. And particularly when, certainly in team sports, we have certain cultures where the way we're expected to kind of behave, to interact with one another. For example, everybody, certainly in professional sport, everybody has to turn up at the same time, get on the same team bus, wearing the same tracksuits, doing the same warm-ups, taking the same approaches, and are not allowed to question it, to turn up in their own time, to necessarily do things in their own way. But we're asking people to, can you live an authentic life in the way that you do that, and how do you unpick those choices? So, for example, if you're playing a sport within a team culture that you don't agree with, you have this situated freedom we talk about. So, how do you unpick what you should do if this sports team or the approach of whatever the coach doesn't fit with your values of life? So that calls for what we call courage and creativity, and existential writers spend a lot of time talking about courage and creativity, and the need for that. There's not a great deal of talk about kind of resilience and a whole of other concepts. There's real kind of fundamental things of courage and what it takes to actually recreate yourself in a certain way. So, as I mentioned before, we're examining human beings, not human doings or human thinking. Now, that should hopefully start to click with one or two people in terms of our philosophical standpoint. We need an overriding or overarching philosophy that looks at human being. Rather than human doing, i.e. behaviorism or human thinking, cognitivism, we need to unpick a kind of philosophical standpoint that fits with what it is to be a human. We look to understand human and being human and how fallible we are. It also has lots of links with humanism and pragmatism, but it's kind of somewhat situated somewhere in between. The other area where existentialism kind of has a bit of almost like a bad name or a depressing name is existentialists seem to spend an awful lot of time looking at death. Now, for those of you working in sports coaching, particularly working with young children, the topic of kind of death probably isn't the first thing that's going to come to your mind in terms of your coaching. But I'd certainly argue that it's part of the journey. And certainly in current times now, COVID has started to make society realize that actually death isn't just a possibility, there's a probability, and it just might be happening to some of us sooner than others, or certainly sooner than we planned. So it's about what can we do in this tiny, minute time that we have on this planet with our life, and it's certainly in terms of our sports careers. Now, again, that for some people that might sound really, really deep for sports coaching. Come on, Harvey, I'm coaching my under-9s netball team. Why on earth would I be kind of discussing, life and death and these sorts of things? But to me, it's about that journey, about helping the individual develop and build an identity themselves. So, as I argued later, and I'll do it another time, things like developing physical literacy is an existential journey. It's about developing who you are, etc. So we need a theoretical framework and an overarching philosophy to kind of work with that. So existentialism has primarily been used in psychiatry and counselling, and that's a very, very different field, and obviously has people come to in a very different kind of context to do towards counselling. But we can still use that, I would argue, towards coaching, because we're getting into this kind of stuff here, kind of looking at conflicts and dilemmas and solutions and how people kind of engage and work their way through this kind of crazy thing called life. Particularly important for those whose whole identity is built around sport. We see more and more, unfortunately, suicides and so on from highly talented individuals who've dedicated their life to sport, only to then have to retire for whatever reason and feel that they have no kind of meaning or anything else left, because their identity is so heavily interacted with their sport and that position. So again, if coaches were actually aware of this and actually helped our athletes through their life journey, then we would start to see that while that may be the kind of the death of our professional athletic career, there's still this identity for us to continue to kind of pursue at another level and at another time. Now, existentialism is being used a little bit in terms of sports psych, but a lot less so again in terms of sports coaching. Existential coaching, which is a very similar field, and we look at life coaching, Peltier argues that these are kind of 10 things that should happen within the coaching. Now, for me, that is sports coaching all over. So working with individuality, actually valuing people taking responsibility for themselves, encouraging choice, being prepared for conflict and confrontation, because us as coaches, we're supposedly there to help, particularly with athletes' needs. We like to work with their wants, but we should also be looking at their needs. So we're work at that. We need to anticipate there is going to be some anxiety and defensiveness, particularly if you try to get athletes to wake up to who they are and to kind of commit to a journey, etc., of development, etc. So where have I heard this before? Well, it sounds very much like we kind of touch upon when we talk about athlete-centered and autonomous supportive coaching. Now, they're kind of philosophical standpoints around humanism and self-determination theory, which are great but are limited. So humanism is this idea that we're all inherently good people and we're all trying to work towards self-actualizing. Without being too critical, I would say that people suggest that I've never coached rugby and martial arts in Dewsbury. Unfortunately, people aren't all trying to self-actualize, and people are at whole different stages of kind of life's journey and trying to deal with that. It's messy. There's all kinds of ethical and moral situations going on that impact us from time to time. So we could do with an overarching philosophy that kind of sits with that. So what does that actually involve? Well, there's no cones, there's no flashy apps. It's know your athlete, talk to your athlete, build a relationship with your athlete, and model this idea of authenticity yourself. So, admitting that you're fallible, you make mistakes, etc., is also part of this journey. We also then need a pedagogy that's actually going to enable us to do this sort of thing. So for me, I would argue quite strongly that a non-linear pedagogy is the way ahead. So non-linear pedagogy values individuality. It's about this journey that each individual goes on to their learning. It's not a step-by-step, this is how to do it paint by numbers approach. So I personally strongly believe that if we take an existential standpoint as our overarching philosophy, and we then allow this to unpack itself through our coaching practices from a non-linear perspective, whilst building those relationships, whilst having that kind of level of communication and unpicking and helping our athletes work towards this kind of this life and helping them find meaning. Again, as I'm desperately running out of time, the three kind of key areas that I spoke about presented for Yokohama, which will be available to anybody that wants them, as that I'd argue that physical literacy is an existential journey. We're helping young children to create a physical identity. So therefore, again, it's part of them understanding themselves and finding meaning. Elite athlete development, I think, it's absolutely essential that this approach is taken. We've seen far too many, elite athletes who kind of go through this journey and then end up with all kinds of mental health issues and unfortunately, in some cases, suicide. Finally, an existential approach, I think, could be transformational for the leadership of the coaches themselves. A tricky journey, a tough journey, but one that's certainly worth taking. And there's some references, and I think I've got about a minute left for questions.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Harvey. Very interesting talk this afternoon. Okay, so I'll open to the floor for questions if we have any for Harvey.
Silence.
Always the way.
Just like one of my lectures.
I mean, I was just interested. You did mention that performance identities are often kind of heavily associated with their sport, and obviously that's been hugely affected by COVID recently, and potentially obviously their sort of their psychological well-being by not being able to take part in their sport. And I presume you think this is a a problem that might need addressing, I suppose. Excuse me. So in the near future, as and when people might be able to return to sport, and I just wondered if you had any, I suppose, recommendations for potentially other coaches that might be in that position where they've got performers that are kind of coming back into activity and need to start to, pay attention to these types of issues that might come to the fore.
Oh, for me, it's about the relationship, and this idea of having an authentic relationship and enabling your athletes to kind of to build towards a more authentic understanding of themselves. So for a lot of people, sport's a massive thing, and they've spent. I know from my own kind of poor levels of cricket through kind of Easter onwards, the prospect of no cricket for a summer, I was seriously kind of getting stressed about it and upset. And to actually being able to then have been allowed to play cricket at the back end for half a dozen or so games has been a real relief. And coaches need to be aware of that. There are going to be people going literally stir crazy because they've not been able to do that. So certainly, kids. My children play pretty much every sport under the sun, or they did, until recently. And again, that's been taken away. And just seeing the difference in kind of behaviour. So with the coaching that I'm doing, you're seeing it in the kids when they're coming into be the the Thai boxing classes or the rugby coaching, etc. The kids, they don't really know what to do with themselves. It's such a shock. So again, these are the things that we need to really start to be aware of and to unpick.
That's very interesting. Do you have any other final questions? We're at time, we're nearly at the 5 o'clock timeline. Jeff, sorry, just about saw your hand there.
Go on, Harvey. Thanks. I guess the question is, what's the so what if you're going to package this for coaches? What's the implications for coach education in terms of your work?
The implications are we drastically need to change where we're going if we're actually going to give this the credit I believe that it certainly deserves. We pay a lot of lip service to this stuff. It kind of sits in a nice little, so we might cover a little bit on coach philosophy. That sits there quite nicely. And we talk about this holistic development, but are we really being holistic? And do we have the kind of the overarching philosophical framework to kind of work with that? Do we ever set our stall out to ensure that we're working with athletes to build their own identities and to kind of to find themselves and to find meaning in their life, which again sounds really grand, but it's about helping from young kids all the way through to elderly performers to find meaning in what they do. So for some people, in Simon's talk, so many people playing golf, physical activity and being out there just striking a ball is quite important to people's both identity and their mental health. So we need to be aware that that's part of it. So our coach education needs to be a lot more cognizant of this. At the minute, we try to push to, and certainly from governing body perspective, it's lots of little packages of this is how you coach, this is the recipe, away you go. These are nice drills, these are activities that you can do. We don't address this is a human being, what they're doing with their life, and how can you help them in any kind of small way or large way.
Pretty straightforward then, Harvey.
Far from it. I never said it was easy.
Thanks, Harvey.
Great stuff. Any final questions for Harvey at all? Great stuff. I think you're off the hook, Harvey.
Good stuff.
Great stuff. We'll wrap up there. So just a quick note for myself, just to say, thank you for everybody for tuning in this afternoon. So it's great to see such good attendance. I think we hit 47 at one point, and just nice just to bring this back into this new academic year, and obviously we'll have seminars on a fortnightly basis. So the next talk will be on the 20th of October. So we'll get calendar invites out shortly for that. We have Anusha Carter, Mohsen Shavidiza, sorry Mohsen, I can never pronounce your surname properly, sorry about that, and myself as well, doing some talks on the 20th of October. So we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Cheers, take care.
Thanks, Marcus. So everyone.